Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, July 27th, 2022, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've heard from international educators over the last week. And as we do each week, we take our 3 questions from news stories that have appeared over the last few days, and we put those out in a newsletter form on Monday mornings in 2 different ways, either through our website where you can subscribe, and I'll be dropping the links to our website in the chat. That's smieconsulting.org/subscribe. You enter your details there. You can get that delivered to your inbox every Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. If you prefer LinkedIn as a way to digest your news content for international education, I'll be dropping a link to the most recent edition of the newsletter through our LinkedIn profile. Where you can subscribe to that newsletter and get that in your feed every Monday as well. So those 3 news stories are themes that we cover each week in question form here on Wednesday come also from those news stories that you get on Monday morning. So each week you can probably guess through some of the concentrated news where we might be focusing our attention each Wednesday for the roundup. So let's get right into it. First question of the week is Bangladesh a country to watch for students, international students? We've been hearing a lot in the last few months about how Bangladesh is, there's some challenges in Bangladesh, but some real strength and opportunities for United States institutions that might be looking to recruit there. It's the next big giant coming out of South Asia. Not going to ever rival India in terms of volume, but certainly as a solid market, there are certainly signs of life there. Bangladesh, in the U.S., Bangladeshi students have risen into the top 20 destinations, sources of international students for the United States. They've steadily risen over the last dozen years or so. Some of the data from the most recent article that I'll be pushing out in the feed will have the details of that. But why is Bangladesh suddenly on the radar? I think part of it has to do with some past challenges in the market, frankly, and those that have been subscribing to the newsletter for a while will have remembered stories earlier in the spring where there was a very large group of Bangladeshi students that got F1 visas, came to the United States, and basically transferred out or disappeared without ever enrolling. And that posed some significant concerns. DHS got involved. It, for the first time I've ever seen, called all these Washington schools that were some of the initial destinations for these students together to a virtual meeting and said, "Hey, this can't happen. Here's what we got to do to put some stopgaps in place to prevent this from happening again." And that's been a real message that hopefully has been taken on board by the institutions. There is a lot of potential fraud in the Bangladeshi market. Visa denial rates have increased since then. But what I will say is the embassy in Dhaka has been very much realizing that they need to be a little bit more proactive since then. And have taken a page from their colleagues to the west in India. U.S. Embassy folks there at the various consulates have been doing an incredible job over recent weeks and months in getting out there on the PR front and sharing how they are making the U.S. visa process more streamlined, opening more positions, freeing up spaces that have been taken up in past by repeats by students that kept getting denied, kept on applying for visa appointments. Those folks have been put on deferments for a certain length of time and freeing up spots for new international students or new Indian students that are looking to go abroad. So they have embassy in Bangladesh has been doing a lot more in that respect. They actually have been seen a number of articles over the last week or two showing how they're trying to copy a page from the Indian consulates, U.S. consulates in India, in terms of doing kind of student visa days. They've recently held a Super Friday, and obviously in Bangladesh, it's one the embassy in Dhaka, and I don't know if they have consulates doing that as well in Chittagong or not. But certainly, if there is one, I'm not sure if there's a consulate in Chittagong. But anyway, they have done a visa day on what they call a Super Friday to help meet the huge demand for student visa interviews. So they're doing a lot to promote. Yes, they realize there's huge demand and they're trying to do something about it. They mentioned at the top of the article that the number of Bangladeshi students in the United States has tripled, almost tripled in the last 10 years. So that's a positive sign, generating kind of renewed hope that this is a market that may be a consistent one for years to come for U.S. institutions. So the U.S. Embassy Consul General in Dhaka has said that they are prioritizing student visas, and they need to be saying that. It's kind of been kind of unwritten rules that student visas are prioritized, particularly in the summer months leading up to the start of the academic year in August, September. So they've had one Super Friday earlier in July, and they're going to do another one this coming Friday on July 29th. That's, again, part of the U.S. Embassy campaign to allow the embassy to meet the high demand for such visas. So the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka has really realized that they had needed to resume regular consular services, make sure they were fully staffed, and they are now designating specific Fridays just for student visa interviews. So it's, again, a way to demonstrate that interest to the Bangladeshi student audience and their parents, obviously. So it goes into some of the details on international students in the United States and Bangladeshi students in the last decade. And there are currently, as of most recent open doors, over 8,500 Bangladeshis enrolled in 2021. That's the 14th the 14th top sending country to the U.S., up 3 places from 17th in the last year or two. So there's some really interesting tidbits in the article that really shares the embassy's desire to make the process smoother. I think what is going to be, if you're experiencing high growth in applications from Bangladesh, you may be very concerned about yield from I-20 stage to enrolled stage, and this should give you some hope. But really, in these circumstances, what I strongly recommend is if you've had Bangladeshi numbers for a while, it may be less of an issue, but in terms of success rates. But certainly, if you are seeing, and this is part of what managing your applications that come in, if you're seeing students coming through particular agencies that aren't getting visas or are getting routinely denied or routinely transfer out, if they do get visas to come, these are the ones that you need to pay attention to, and maybe either make some hard and fast rules with them that can't happen in future, or drop them entirely. But this is something that you certainly need to be focused on as an issue, because the Washington colleges and universities that got called onto the carpet earlier in the year certainly would agree that there needs to be better screening, that there's a substantial fraud that goes on, and it really comes down to how are these students being vetted before they come to you. They just, if they're applying solo without any help either from Education USA or from agents that are reputable in the market, that are ARC accredited or certified, these are the things that you should be paying particular attention to, that you want to make sure that you're covering yourself in a lot of respects. And I know there are some institutions I've worked at, others that I've known, the people who run the International Admissions Office as well, that would require applicants in certain markets where there's high fraud or high visa denial rates, requiring their students to go through Education USA offices in country, particularly for that visa prep, before you will make decisions on their applications, because it's really a point of clarity that you need to get to. We've had at a school I'm working with now, we've had it arranged, particularly because of the fear of denial, that a particular agency is saying, well, why don't we have students pay first semester tuition deposit, because we don't, at this particular school, we don't require any deposits for international students to get their I-20s. So that was a path we went down to see if that would help improve that student's chance of qualifying for a visa to come to the United States. We'll see if they make it here, but that was certainly something we built in to help adjust, make the process a little bit smoother for that particular student. And maybe that's a rule. Back in the early mid 90s, working at an institution that where they saw periods of high visa denial rates, or for students from particular countries, they would institute a tuition deposit that was a full semester tuition deposit before they would issue an I-20, as a way to document these are serious students, because that's the concern for a lot of these, for the consulates in these countries, is that they're afraid these students are going to get visas and then disappear into the woodwork, like this group of Bangladeshi students did earlier this year. So nobody wants to get caught in that mix or run afoul of DHS in that respect and get blackballed. Certainly it impacts the consular folks, but in Bangladesh in particular, it certainly seems like they're being on the front foot on this part to really focus on being student focused in their visa scheduling, and that's certainly a positive sign. But there's always more that we can do on the institutional end to help make sure that the students we're putting through are on the up and up, that they're fully vetted, that they're properly advised on the ground in country and by you in terms of what steps to take in the process. So it's a positive first story out of the gate. That Bangladesh is certainly one that I would be keeping my eyes on as an international admissions expert. Certainly it is a country that will continue to receive substantial attention from U.S. colleges and increasingly from a broader range of colleges. So we'll certainly see that market, I think, continue to grow in terms of interest in the United States. There's a lot of push factors for those that are coming out of Bangladesh to go abroad, and certainly we're seeing we're the recipients of a good percentage of them who are hoping to find better opportunities outside their home country. Another market, perhaps on the other end of the scale, the number one source market for U.S. For international students in the United States, and that's China. And it's a market that has gone through several evolutions over the years. It had been largely a graduate market in the 90s and early 2000s, transitioned very quickly from to a more undergraduate focused market to a point in maybe 2012, 2013, where it was about even between undergraduate and graduate Chinese students in the United States. Undergraduates have certainly surpassed the graduate numbers, but we've seen a drop in the undergraduate over recent years, and certainly the pandemic has dropped it very significantly. And not necessarily has there have been some dampening of interest in the United States in China, but there's also been kind of a plateau that's coming of available college-age students that might be interested and available to come to the United States. There are other markets that have increased their market share, seen the UK benefit dramatically from increased interest from China and significant numbers from China. Over 30 to 40% of international students on college campuses in the UK, university campuses, are from China now. So that's their number one source. It's our number one source. It's Australia's number one source. New Zealand as well. Canada it's number two after India. But it is certainly the behemoth, 800-pound gorilla in the room in terms of markets, student markets out there. And there is inevitably going to be a drop-off, and there was a drop-off starting probably in 2015 for many U.S. colleges that had been seeing kind of the gravy train of undergraduate Chinese students kind of peak around that time and then begin to drop off. There's, again, I said, increased competition now for those same students. But we're also at a point where we came out of the Trump administration into the pandemic, where there was depressed interest and inability to come to the United States since the pandemic. Even now, the travel restrictions are just beginning to break up a little bit. That would allow, hopefully, a larger group of Chinese students to come to the United States in the fall, and that's still the hope of many colleges. But what I have seen is a number of individuals, perhaps perhaps not the day-to-day international admission folks, but senior leadership at some campuses begin to question whether China is still a relevant market. And I have to control myself when I hear that kind of a response or question that when you look at it, for this particular institution I'm talking about, it's the number one source of students for that institution. And it would be incredibly short-sighted for an institution to say, if in that particular situation where China is your number one market for international students, that yes, it's a little bit harder. There's more issues involved with political tensions and that type of thing, other issues in terms of travel getting out. But is that a reason to abandon the number one market for your institution and for most of the Western world that brings in international students? It's their number one market. Is turning away from China ever a good idea? Certainly, you might not be 100% all in, and this is where we're going to focus all our eggs in our international recruitment basket. You never want to be in that situation, and I certainly would encourage anyone who's going down that route to quickly about face and balance out and be a little bit more proactive in terms of diversifying where you're recruiting. But you never want to turn away from your number one goal. Our number one source of international students. That's the only situation where that would ever occur is if we go to war with China. And that maybe there are potential possibilities of that happening down the road over Taiwan perhaps. But you see, and the only time that's ever really happened in terms of completely shutting off a valve of students was in 1980 when with the Iranian hostage crisis. Iranian students were the number one international student group in the United States in 1980. And when the hostage takeover happened, the revolution happened in Iran, and the hardline Ayatollahs came on board, that changed everything for that country. We still don't have an embassy in Iran since that time. So it's been 42 years, and we still don't have an embassy again there. So that is the very rare circumstance. And that would be the only situation if we were at war with China that I could see the Chinese student market drying up completely. But for it to go for China to go the way of Iran in terms of international student interest at this point, it's very hard to imagine such a situation happening. And certainly I'm not advocating putting all of your recruitment eggs in the China basket, because that's foolish. But it is, if it's your number one market now, to completely abandon it or to not invest to maintain it and keep up with the changes that are going on there is certainly a direction I would never advocate for any institution I'm consulting with. That to ignore your number one markets is a fool's errand, frankly. And I would certainly recommend that should never be your strategy. In terms of articles that we're referencing today, we talk about the changes that are going on in China, and you see what's happened during the pandemic with China's what most will call in the West an over-the-top reaction to having a zero tolerance policy to COVID, when most Western nations have recognized, hey, COVID's a reality of life. It's endemic at this point. If we have cases, we're dealing with much more virulent streams, but much less damaging streams in terms of long-term impacts of them on the majority of populations. So to go full lockdown when you have a few cases is just not a practical reality for most in the West. But China has kept on that stance, and the situation in Shanghai in the earlier spring, where they were on lockdown for 2 months or longer, had significant repercussions for the international school community that lost all their teachers, who were forced to evacuate, for international students that were trying to get back into the country to continue their schooling were kept out. Universities certainly are still trying to get international students back in, and only slight cracks in those doors are opening to allow that to happen. So China's really hurt themselves as a destination, but they've also, in their over-the-top reaction to COVID, have certainly shown, and over the top lockdowns and such, have forced a lot of students to start thinking, well, maybe I don't want to stay in country for university and I do want to go abroad, and making late decisions that, they hadn't taken any English proficiency tests yet, maybe only are planning to take the Gaokao, and then maybe that's the time this summer where they decided, well, we want to look elsewhere because don't know if staying in China is the best option at this point. So there's a lot of moving parts in as there are with any country, but with China in particular, there's an article from Inside Higher Ed in the past week that talks about a new mindset for recruiting Chinese students is needed because of the pandemic lockdowns have strained family budgets, time for colleges to develop more inclusive strategies for recruiting and admitting Chinese students. This is an approach from Amherst College that has looked at the changes they've seen in the family landscape and in terms of funding. One of the results from their survey of parents, particularly they're looking at incoming undergraduates, that said a staggering 90% of parents indicated they will be the primary source of funding for their children's education in the U.S. So there is certainly, with the increased pressures from the pandemic and the lockdowns, that you have family incomes have dropped depending on the parents' jobs, and that you really see that the impression that the Amherst survey seems to indicate is that, this is a quote from the article, most Chinese families are under the impression that if their children apply for financial aid at U.S. colleges, their chances of admission will be greatly reduced. Their concern is not unfounded, as there are only 7 colleges in the U.S. that adopted need-blind policies for both domestic and international applicants. So Amherst happens to be one of those. But for those that are truly keeping their doors open in terms of how you talk about your institution, by offering financial assistance in the form of, most institutions would be in the form of merit aid, that you make it clear that that process is separate from admissions. Scholarship process, it may be connected to the admissions decision, but it's not going to determine whether you're admitted or not. Certainly, it'll affect whether you can get an I-20 if you've got enough funding to come. But that's something that they take that approach from China. So it's that's a particular concern of Chinese families at this point. So it's important, I think, to really take a look at where you're coming from in how you approach the Chinese market. And certainly you never want to be abandoning it, particularly if you're looking for the undergraduate Chinese market. There's still plenty of interest in the United States, but it's not going to be, as it is in a lot of countries, it's not going to be as easy because there are more countries, institutions that are going after these same students. So you will have to work a bit harder and change the way you do things a little bit, because you can't let the same policies that you had in place 5-10 years ago be what drives your recruitment strategies today. Because countries change, and how you reach students in particular countries will change over time, and what messages they will want to hear change over time. So you need to be adaptable in terms of your messaging, in terms of your policies, and in terms of how you approach different markets and what tools you use to access certain markets. So very important to a question that seems a little bit silly on surface is, can you ever turn away from the Chinese market? Of course not. But the reality is some institutions are, and how you deal with that is certainly one that we want to pay attention to as we move forward and develop plans for the next recruitment cycle. So now, in terms of strategies, this is our third question of the day. How do you define your international recruitment strategy? This is particularly relevant for me this week. I'm going to do a 2-day workshop for an institution I've been consulting with for a while this week. And the theme of the conference is reframing internationalization. And when we're talking about what that means is how there's a unit that has kind of an all-in-one international unit that does inbound and outbound international students, English language, as well as study abroad, but also international partnerships. So the theme of this conference is reframing internationalization on campus. And the point of it is to really show that it takes a campus to enroll a class. It takes of international students and graduate them successfully into alumni. It takes a campus to promote study abroad and embed the concept of internationalization in curriculum, in faculty exchanges, in students that are in the classroom. So what that looks like. So this is what we'll be talking about during this conference. And it brings me to this question of how do you define your international recruitment strategy? And there are obviously many ways to do this. And 3 articles in the past week kind of pop in that touch on this topic from slightly different angles. We have Scott Jashik Inside Higher Ed that shares an interview with an author. Richard Joseph has a new book called Bridging the Gap Between the Abundance of American Higher Education Talent and the Immense Foreign Demand for It, the Great Chasm in Global Education. So this is really, he's a former president of Babson Global, that part of Babson College that was working with education institutions around the world to design curricula, improve educational delivery capacity, that type of thing. So his book really focuses on this great chasm and how institutions can bridge it, the chasm between talent and abundance of higher ed talent and the quality of our institutions and the foreign demand for it is that great global chasm. How do we bridge that? How do we meet those needs, that demand through the supply that we have? And this is something I always talk about. I'll be talking about again at this conference I mentioned we're doing this week on reframing internationalization, is recognizing that we have, in looking at things from a global perspective, that the U.S. is one of many countries that are actively trying to recruit international students to their institutions of higher education. We are the #1 source, and we have been for decades, and always been the #1 source, frankly, for international destination for international students. But that our share of that pie, global student mobility pie, has shrunk from less than a third in 1990 from more than a third in 1990 to 20% in 2022. So we're looking at, but it's also that pie has gotten a whole lot bigger. So, but our share of that pie, though it has shrunk, we have consistently up until the pandemic had only a couple of years where there was negative international student growth. We had a couple down years again because of the pandemic, but I assume that I'm pretty certain that fall 21's data for the 2021-22 academic year that's just passed will show an uptick of international student numbers overall, and this fall I think will be similar increases. But what we're seeing is that pie has gotten bigger, our share of it has decreased, and what we have to do to keep up in terms of continuing to bring top talent in needs multilateral support to happen both on campus and off campus. So it requires institutions to work with their elected officials to have legislation passed that makes it easier for international students to come. It makes international organizations and institutions that you partner with on exchanges, on cooperative agreements, on research, on all these collaborative projects to broaden the scope of internationalization and what that looks like on your campus. And those are some of the bigger picture ones that the author really makes the point that it's not just all about bringing students in, more students from overseas in. It's about making it a real campus-wide, institution-wide initiative to buy in to globalization and global education. So that's one particular take. It's kind of a real 30,000-foot view. Then you have the folks at INTED that really get into some of the details of what your recruitment planning should be driven by. They come up with the formula that they recommend, that you develop access custom research on your differentiators as an institution that make you stand out, that show what your strongest recruitment options are, what countries, regions you need to be in, and develop the messaging that engages your target audiences on the channels that they are using. That's kind of what they boil down essential recruitment strategies to be. And I certainly agree with that it really needs to that yes, we're the United States, but and there are certain values then that come along with coming to the United States and all that it represents that need to be part of your marketing strategy, and that's probably a part that not a lot of colleges do emphasize in their international recruitment, is from why the United States is a major destination and should be the top destination for students, is some of those things that certainly the INTED formula does not focus on, but it certainly would need, in my opinion, would need to be part of that conversation. But the elements that they're talking about with INTED certainly need to show how you're different from the competition, not just in the United States, but from institutions and countries around the world that might have their own advantages. You need to be sharing how yours make you a better option. So that's a very kind of opposite view of that kind of 30,000 foot view. It's getting very granular. But then you have the folks at Keystone who have shared 6 trends in recruitment that certainly are all very valid and certainly form a lot of what I talk about with the 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management. Part of what I'll be sharing at this conference tomorrow and Friday is things like meet the students where they are. Learn how to manage effectively, and that means understanding not only your staff that are involved in the day-to-day doing of international, but also managing up. How are you informing leadership at your institution of what's going on in the marketplace, what's changing, how we can adapt, how we need to adapt, and where we might be vulnerable, where we can shore up our resources. They also talk about investing in the right technologies, being aware of what some of those newer tools are that can help give you an advantage, a leg up over the competition, by tracking, having a decent set of analytics that you can refer to show how you're funneling students through your admissions process, what the top of the funnel looks like, what your yield is, all of these types of things, having an understanding of what that is. And that's not a given at most campuses, but having that CRM that allows you to get to that point where you can manage your communication effectively, that can give you the analytics you need to show results. It also means getting creative. It means using other industry data to your advantage to show how, say, labor trends in particular markets are important to your target demographic. Looking at the push and pull factors that are driving students away from their home countries or pulling them towards the United States, being aware of those things, the bigger picture things that maybe the 30,000 foot view does. So there's some really interesting takes on these 3 levels that I think are well worth including in your mix. Certainly, there's some details that are very granular, but there's also some themes throughout these 3 articles that I think are very appropriate and need to be taken on board when you're developing your own international recruitment strategies. So we'll be sharing that out again with the conference that I'll be presenting at this week. But we're really looking forward to having more of these conversations with you in the weeks to come, and we really appreciate you being a part of the conversation here on the Midweek Roundup. Have a great rest of your week. And for those of you who are joining in these regularly, I will be at the Education USA Forum in Washington, D.C. next week. We'll be doing a live on Facebook from that conference. Looking forward to reconnecting with the regional coordinators as well as advisors from 50 countries at that event, as well as embassy community folks. So until next week from D.C., we'll see you then. Cheers.